Alrighty. Ooh, it's entirely the wrong set of lights. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. I am currently in a life or death struggle with the Duo mobile app for two-factor authentication. It has locked me out of all of my U of A accounts, and I can't figure out why. And IST is about as helpful as a bottle of whiskey at an AA meeting. So, yeah, if you're sending me emails today, I might get them. I might not. Nothing's working. Why did they pick this app that is the least user-friendly thing I've ever seen? I don't know. Because it's U of A. So that's why I was a little bit late. I was on the phone with them, and I may have gotten a little salty. Oh, IST, I love you, and yet, please outsource to India, where someone could do your jobs better. Okay, so how are all of you? Like, obviously, we've done the midterm. Now, like, 2/3 of the class has decided not to show up. So, you know, obviously deep at work on the major lab. Any questions? Oh, that was very, you were just waiting for that.
For the last question, I was having trouble making it 250 words.
Like minimum?
Yeah.
Don't worry about it.
Oh.
It's let's say it's a guideline rather than a hard and fast rule. So if it's shorter than 250 words for sampling method, don't worry about it.
Literally 50 words. Is that
okay? Sure. As long as it makes sense, right? Like,
okay.
as long as you're making sense, I probably am not going to count words. Yeah, the guideline, they're more guidelines. It's to keep it usually shorter, but not too short. So if you feel like you've explained it, go with that. Okay. Other questions about the major lab, or if any questions about the midterm? Now, I will tell you this about the midterm. I haven't even looked at it. It's like 10th down on my list of to-do things. First, make email work again. Second, where is IST? Related question. Yeah, it's been a morning. Yeah, please.
Should we be justifying the like operational depth definitions and like question sets that we choose?
I would say like, oh yeah, like if you choose like like an existing scale, I don't think you need to, do much for justifying it other than, to just say that it's this scale, it's widely used. That's why you're using it. Beyond that, I don't think you need anything more. You don't need to go in depth as to why this scale is better. I chose this loneliness scale versus this loneliness scale because this loneliness scale has been developed for 15 years and this one has only been developed for 13 years. And then, please be kind to me. I have to read like 50 of these. So you don't need to justify to that extent. Just like it's well recognized. Boom, you're done. All good.
For like how we're operating, because like I know we have to kind of like, it's good for us to kind of talk about like indicators and stuff. So should we be talking about which specific questions in our survey are going to be related to each indicator?
I don't think you need that level of detail if you've outlined your indicators. Just because I will figure it out. Yeah.
Okay. For a proposal for how you conduct your research, is that kind of what we did on the lab too, where it was like the variables, the nominal definition?
Yeah. So like, are you going to do a survey? Are you doing an experiment? Where are you going to do your, where are you going to do this survey if you're going to do it? Is it going to be students at U Alberta, or, like explain how this project would actually look, right? So that you're proposing that this is how I would do the project. I would, survey these people in this place, or I would.
So you don't have to give the nominal and operating?
Oh, you definitely do, but you also have to like outline like how you would actually do the research, right? I would take 2 people, one male, one female from each of the districts, and put them in an arena and watch them fight to the death, right? That would be your or something, right? Yes, that Hunger Games. But yeah, that would be, you need to justify or just like explain what this would actually look like as part of that section. I did, I think, didn't I? Can I get into eClass? Yes, eClass isn't locked off by two-factor authentication, which I somehow broke because I'm so smart. Or stupid. I don't know which one. All I did was try to add my new phone to Duo Mobile. Sorry, I am confusing the people watching online. But I did put, I believe, okay, it was like 2 a.m. So if I failed, I'm going to blame it on that. But I believe I put example of Major Lab 1 right there. So if you want to look at someone who did really well a couple of years ago, you can take a look at that. Don't do it now. Now we have class. But do it later. So that might help you as well. Yeah, with kind of how it looks. And I'm sorry it took me so long. It just, yes, chaos. My life is chaos. Any other questions before I jump into talking about qualitative research methods? Your favorite topic and mine, I'm sure. He laughs at me. Anyone? We're good? Okay. I guarantee, and I just want you to know that all of the examples are going to be furry based just for you. No, I'm kidding. But they will be because that's where my brain goes. Okay. So obviously we've been talking through most of the course so far about quantitative research methods, and you're going to be submitting your quantitative proposal, right? Your Major Lab number 1 on Sunday before the stroke of midnight, at which point something turns back into a pumpkin and you can no longer submit without penalty. Okay, so qualitative research, right, is the other kind of side of the, wow, I made that text really small. Oh, whatever. Qualitative research, right, is the other side of the coin in terms of social research. And basically, right, where quantitative research is concerned with quantifying, the social world and turning it into something that is measurable. Qualitative research is principally kind of interested in people's experience and putting that into words and images. And there is a ton of different qualitative methods that you can use, which is why we're going to spend the last, half of this course basically talking about it. Okay. So, we laid out these terms earlier in the course, right? In terms of, it's really bothering me that that's so small. I can barely see it. Let's make it bigger. Oh, I broke it. Now it's getting smaller again. There we go. Okay. It's ugly, but it works. Okay. There we go. That's a little bit easier. So it's usually inductive, right? So we'll generally start not from a hypothesis that you then try to get data to prove, but almost always, right, it starts with field research from which you then try to come up with an explanation, right? It's like you go out, you gather your data, and then you kind of come up with the concepts and theories that you use to explain it, right? Okay, so it looks very different, right? And when you actually go and do it, it can be a lot of fun. I've done both quantitative and qualitative research. The qualitative stuff I always find is more interesting because it's just like, casting your boat out into the sea and trying to figure out what happens, right? And then, because you can find some really interesting things that you weren't expecting in qualitative research, because it's just like, I'm going to go explore, and then, once I've explored a little, then I can start thinking of questions. It's interpretivist, right? So it's concerned with finding out what actions and events mean to people, right? We're interested in, with qualitative research, people's interpretation of their own social worlds, right? How do they understand their lives? How do they understand the phenomenon that they're living through, right? What is it like for them? And writing kind of rich accounts of this is what qualitative research is really, really good at, right? It deals with the why in a lot of ways, right? Why are people acting this way? What is it about their understanding of the world that leads them to do certain things, think certain things, understand certain things the way they do? It's very, very interesting. It's often constructionist, right? Social life not being seen as fixed, but the outcome of interactions and negotiations. And it takes a naturalist perspective, right? So this is, the perspective of, going out into the social world, and trying to, almost like you would, you're observing. Oh, this is going to sound like a terrible metaphor, but I'm going to use it anyway, right? That's because I went to bed at like 2:30 in the morning last night because I was working on something. And I'm very tired, so terrible metaphors are going to be where it's at today, right? You're going out and you're observing, gorillas in their natural environment. You want to leave that environment as undisturbed as possible so you get the most natural kind of setting. In qualitative research, right, in a sense, but with humans, right, you're trying to observe what's naturally going on in the social environment without disturbing it and, without reactivity as much as possible. Okay. So there are a ton, and there's probably more than this even, of types of qualitative research, right? So probably the two big ones, the ones that you will hear about the most when you're talking about qualitative research, is ethnography and participant observation, and qualitative interviewing, right? So, ethnography, basically, and we'll do a whole unit on ethnography and what this looks like. It's basically immersing yourself in a social setting, right? It's, joining the gang in order to do gang research, hanging out with the furries to understand what it's like to be a furry, basically you go into these, you want to understand what it's like to be a female engineer in an oil firm. You go and you kind of observe a female engineer or female engineers in oil firms, right? You immerse yourself in those social settings. You are writing a rich account based on your own observations of that situation. Okay, so that's ethnography. Qualitative interviewing is the next one. It's my favorite. That's the one I really like, because I find that one, in a lot of ways is the easiest to do. Especially now, it depends what you're doing, obviously, but especially now with like Zoom and Google Meet and Skype, right? You can do a lot of qualitative interviewing from your couch, which makes life a lot better. You put on a dress shirt, but you're still wearing your pajama pants. It can be the best interview of your life. Qualitative interviewing, right? In-depth interviewing. Typically, we're talking here about semi-structured or unstructured interviewing. And don't worry, we'll get into exactly what each of those looks like. Focus groups. Cheap interviews, as I like to call them. But basically, focus groups are interviews with several people together. They're basically a form of interviewing. I laugh because we were having this discussion in the CCR the other day. My boss was saying that she doesn't know why anyone would ever use a focus group instead of doing qualitative interviewing. And I'm like, yeah, but you've always had like $2 million budgets for your project. When you have a budget of $80,000 and you want to interview 40 people, focus groups are a much faster, much more efficient way of doing that than, actually interviewing each person separately, which is incredibly time consuming. Yeah, please.
So then everyone gets to hear each other's answers.
Yeah.
And so wouldn't that have like a lot of reactivity effects, like
It can. Yeah. They're
with honesty?
sometimes there's advantages and disadvantages, and we'll talk about focus groups in great detail till you're sick of it and you never want to hear about a focus group ever again. Some advantages of focus groups, right? Yeah, there can be questions about whether people will be honest. It's less of a problem when people don't know each other in focus groups, like a bunch of strangers will tend to be pretty honest. One of the advantages is sometimes the focus group participants, like one person will say something, which will spark another person to think about something they hadn't thought about, and they'll add in, and it can kind of build in interesting ways that you wouldn't get in a one-on-one interview because maybe you didn't ask the right question or you didn't think of the right thing, right? So there's advantages and disadvantages. The biggest advantage of focus groups, though, is that they're cheap, like in terms of time and energy and money, right? Comparatively, that's always my thing. But yeah, you get less depth from each interview participant, which is one problem because, like if you were doing an interview, you might spend an hour or two with each participant. A focus group, you're going to spend probably 3 hours with a group of, 4 to 10 people. So you're only going to get snippets from each person. They have their place, but obviously, yeah, there's drawbacks and there's pluses to it. Okay, discourse and conversation analysis, where you analyze language. That might actually have my crown for my least favorite type of qualitative research, and we'll look at it. It's I find it very dull, but some people do it and like it. You know, everyone's different. But if I had to do it, I'd probably quit and go work at McDonald's. If I could get a job at McDonald's. Maybe I'm not qualified. I don't know. Yeah.
Is that just where you like pick a word and just like see how many times it comes up in a paper or something?
That's more quantitative discourse analysis. Like sometimes discourse and conversation analysis is like, and we will talk about it, but it's super boring. Even now, thinking about it, I'm too bored to continue this sentence. No, I'm kidding. It would be like, okay, I'm going to sit there and watch two people have a conversation, or I'm going to have a conversation with someone, and I'm going to note things like, all right, when I said this, so I said, hi, my name's Dr. Broussard, and I note like what they said in response, like, oh, hi, I'm Tim. Okay, so a greeting was met with another greeting. All right, that's interesting. And then, okay, and then we proceeded to small talk. It's like, strange weather we're having today. Yes, it is. Oh my God, it's like, even thinking about it. There's way more to it than that, but you're noting like the conversational dynamics. Like if I introduce myself as Dr. Broussard instead of Jeff, oh, did that change my interaction with people, right? Did they, you know, like you're talking about like role-taking dynamics, power relations in conversations. It might be more dull than I'm making it sound. All sorts of stuff in there. Facial expressions, right? Yeah, like when I said, you know, I'm Dr. Broussard. Also, I dress up as a furry on weekends, and they're like, you know, then you're like, okay, that was their facial reaction, or they stiffened up, or they responded in this way, or it took them 3 seconds to respond. So many things in it, and honestly, I find it. I'm like, who does this? Linguists. They have mental problems. I have a lot of friends who are linguists, but I swear to God, like I've read their dissertations, and I'm like, I'm sorry, you like this? Why? We're all different, but I can't figure it out. Yeah. So yeah, discourse and conversation analysis is like, oh, what kind of phraseology are people using? Like, what kind of sentence structure did they use when they were in this position? How did they react when they were like, hey, do you want to have coffee tomorrow? And the other person was like, yeah, I'm kind of busy tomorrow. Maybe next week. And it's like, well, let me check my schedule. Well, just text me, right? It'd be like how this back and forth went on as one person's clearly trying to avoid going for coffee with the other person, which is everyone I meet who went to high school with me and wants to have coffee later. This is how it goes. This is like, yeah, we'll get into it and we'll go through it and you'll see how unbelievably boring it is. Or you will find it to be the greatest method ever and you will want to do it because that's what you like. And I shouldn't be judgmental, but yawn. Content analysis. Content analysis is actually really fun too. I've done lots of content analysis in my days, right? Where basically you're doing qualitative analysis of texts and documents, right? So you can look at not just like quantitative content analysis, which is like I counted the word "the" 72 times in the article. No, or patriarchal language was used 1,000 times in today's issue of the Wall Street Journal, right? That's quantitative. Qualitative is more like trying to dig into the meanings, right? Like I watched, the TV show Breaking Bad, and I'm like interpreting it and pulling out the meaning. It's a lot more like kind of English literature analysis than, it's a lot like film studies, TV analysis, right? All of that literature analysis would all be forms of qualitative content analysis, right? Where you're looking at a specific piece of content and interpreting it, reading it from a qualitative perspective. What does it say about the people who made it? What does it say about the audience that enjoys it? All of these sorts of things are part of qualitative content analysis. Okay. And participatory action research. Basically this is activism blended with academic research, right? So engage participants to produce social change, right? So the researcher takes on the role, and we'll talk about each of these in turn. The researcher basically acts as like a catalyst for some kind of activism. I am the worst person to talk about this because I would never do that kind of research for lots of personal reasons. Okay, so how does this work? Main steps of qualitative research are pretty straightforward, right? You have a general research question, right? Which, hey, guess what? Next week, that will be your mini lab number 1, or number 4. Number 4. Number one for the second part of the course. We'll be generating a qualitative research question. So you're going to have to... Did my boss just tell me she has COVID? Oh, that's fun. I was standing 2 feet from her yesterday. That'll be nice. Right, so you start with a general kind of research question about some kind of qualitative phenomenon, right? And it could be like, what is it like to be a furry, right? It's usually like about experience in some way, right? So, how do female sociology students experience, the one math class that they have to take as part of their undergraduate degree? What is students' experience of taking transit to get to school, right? You're talking about their experience kind of in a qualitative way. So you're looking for people to describe it, right? It could be lots of things, right? Like, obviously depending on the methodology that you choose, you can be talking about a whole bunch of different things, like, the meaning of a particular text, like what does it mean for people to keep a diary? And you can do content analysis of people's diaries if you can get people to hand over their diaries, right? All sorts of things. Qualitative research is a pretty wide open sort of field, so you can have a lot of fun with coming up with research questions for it. The next one, selecting relevant sites and subjects. Like, okay, you've got a general idea, something that you're interested in, right? Well, where are you going to research it, right? If you want to research, the TV, you're kind of generally interested in the difference between TV production in Vancouver as compared to LA, right? Then you're like, okay, now I have to get access to some kind of TV production sets in Vancouver and LA, right? So I've got to get in, those are my relevant sites, right? If you want to study the furries, right? Well, where do the furries gather? If you want to study bikers, right? Where do bikers gather? That's going to be your relevant research site. And who are your subjects? Like, who do you want to study? Do you want to study the Hells Angels? Do you want to study undergraduate students? Do you want to study, and you can get really granular with it, right? Like LGBTQ students who take SOS 100, right? Do you want to look at that, right? You can get really granular with like the population you want to look at. Okay, and now this is where it's a little bit different than quantitative, right? Because, after you had your research question in quantitative, you would have had a hypothesis. Here, you're going to go straight to data collection, right? You're going to collect the relevant data. So you will start to do actual research. And then, you're going to do some research, maybe a pilot study, interpret the data, come up with theories, maybe refine your research question, and then you're going to test if your kind of understanding lines up with what's actually going on by going and collecting further data, typically, right? Sometimes it's referred to as grounded theory, but you see a lot of this in qualitative research, right? You start to do interviews, and people tell you something that's really interesting, and you go and you interpret that data, and you're like, okay, I think this is what's going on. And then you go and do more interviews where basically you start asking people about the things that you found out in that first set of interviews to check whether that's the case, right? So, I did, anyway, we can talk about this when we talk about interviewing maybe. But, I certainly did this in my dissertation project, right? Where, the first few interviews I did, people told me some really interesting things. And then I did further interviews with some of the people that snowballed out of those first interviews, right? So I asked them, like, who should I interview next? And they're like, this person, interviewed that person. And then I checked a lot of the things that, other people had told me against their experience. And if they were like, yeah, that's totally right, I was like, okay, I think I understand. And if they said, no, that's totally wrong, then I knew I had to go and do more research. And you can do this a bunch of times, right? You can kind of circle through this area for a long time. You can get trapped in the endless cycle of qualitative research and never escape. And then your dissertation takes 10 years. And eventually the university just kicks you out because they're tired of taking your money. I'm kidding, that part will never happen. They will never tire of taking your money. But right, you keep going back through until typically you have a pretty good sense that you've exhausted the subject. And then you move on to writing up the findings and conclusions, right? Either in like a dissertation or a book or journal articles or whatever. And this is basically the process of qualitative research.
So you really don't approach it with any kind of like hypothesis what you think is going to be the results?
No, you can have a general sense, but typically you're gathering the data to then kind of generate a theory of what's going on, which you then test against further rounds of data collection. Make sense? Okay. Just check the time. 11:30. Okay. So yeah, the main steps of qualitative research, right? Establish a general research question. What's interesting about the social issue you are studying, right? So here, do high crime communities have low social control, right? Do high crime communities have, less resources for their schools, right? All of these sorts of things, right? You figure out what's interesting, what you think you want to study. And this is it's hard because with qualitative research, it can be so broad that narrowing it down can be really difficult. Figure out your research site, who are you going, in this case, residents of high crime neighborhoods, and you collect the data, determine which methods to use, which are the best ones. It might be more appropriate to use one or to use more than one method, ethnographic observation and interviews. One of the things that, here's where like qualitative research will often be multi-method, right? Where it's like my dissertation project, I did interviews and I did content analysis, and they, each provided kind of a rich account of what I was studying in some different ways, right? So yeah, you can have a multiple kind of methods approach where, because one research method might have certain limitations, if you combine two of them, you're going to get a much richer picture. And typically, the most typical two, right, are you combine the two big ones, ethnographic research and interviews, like the project that my boss is working on right now, which is, basically going to combine ethnographic work in prisons with interviews, right? So that's the most kind of typical combination, but content analysis and interviews, content analysis and ethnography. My first supervisor of my PhD, who disappointed me terribly and let me down and hurt me so bad. Her big project had been ethnography, interviews, and content analysis, right? So she had combined three into a single project. So you can do a lot of this with qualitative research. If you think there's a case for something that's complementary, you can definitely go ahead and do that. Now, when you're working on your mini and major labs, you might want to propose a single one, just to keep your life simpler, because, there's a lot of complexity that goes into thinking about using multiple methods. But I think, a lot of people who are doing qualitative work are doing multiple methods kind of work within their particular subject, as opposed to mixed methods, right? Where mixed methods is more, anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. This is because I'm tired. Mixed methods is more mixing qualitative and quantitative. Multiple methods would be more using things that are within the same aegis. Okay, I already talked about these a little bit. But yeah, you interpret the data, right? Residents don't perceive crime as a problem because there's low incidence of violent crime in spite of a high crime rate. So what does it mean in the social environment? Conceptual and theoretical work, evaluate your data, the data related to your research question, and kind of come up with, an explanation for it. Okay, and then here's the cycle of doom where you can get kind of stuck, and I've seen lots of researchers get stuck in this phase, especially grad students that have poor supervisors that don't give them enough guidance. That wasn't me. I'm self-motivated. I didn't need my supervisor, which is good because she was useless. But I'm not bitter. No, I am. So you get a tighter and tighter specification of your research question. If you have to, you collect further data to test, whether now you have an explanation that exhausts all possible data that you've gathered. And then once you kind of get there, maybe new research subject with, sorry, I'm really tired. Research with either new subjects or you revisit some subjects. Maybe you go and re-interview people if you have to. You write up your findings. This is how we demonstrate our credibility, by publishing in better journals than the the people that are our academic rivals. Yeah, so basically that's the goal, right? Is to publish and get that research out in the world. Okay, so yeah, go ahead. No, don't be sorry. No, don't be sorry.
Do you need to like relate your research to a theoretical framework or concept?
You pose an interesting question. You don't necessarily have to. A lot of people do. Like, I mean, are you thinking here like the big traditions like Marxism, functionalism, or
I was kind of thinking like number 5, conceptual and theoretical work.
yeah, I mean, so the answer to this, I think, is at times yes and at times no. And I know that's a tremendously unhelpful answer. I mean, there's a lot of people that will take existing literature, right, and try to find a framework within existing literature that they can use to kind of explain a phenomenon, or at least the orientation of their general research, right? Like, sometimes you'd be more typically, I think, in qualitative research, aligning with like a middle range theory where you're like, oh, Smith and Smith and Smith did this kind of research and presented this kind of framework. And so I'm kind of approaching it through that framework. And then you would refine their kind of theoretical framework, right? So if it's like about, young people and crime, it's like, okay, Brian Hogeveen says this. And, I followed his kind of theoretical approach. And what I found was this, which caused me to refine Hogeveen's theory to include this and this and this. Does that kind of answer your question?
But you don't need to like really connect it to any kind of theoretical framework or concept.
No, you might. I say like in qualitative research, you're much more likely to instrumentalize theory. Like, a theorist will hate me for saying this. Please don't tell Richard I said this. Richard Westerman, our in-house theorist, because he'll hunt me down and strangle me with his very attractive British tie. You laugh. A lot of times in qualitative research, I think you instrumentalize it. So it's like, there's this theory like critical media industry theory. And you're like, okay, so I'm going to approach my research using this kind of framework, but you almost use it as a set of tools, right? It's like, so it tells me that I should do research like this and this and this. And so I'll do it that way, but without being like, I'm relating it to like a Marxist or a feminist framework. You don't have to do that. Some people do, some people don't. I don't like doing that because I'm not a theory person, because I don't hate life and don't love reading Foucault. But some people will, right? Some people will be like, okay, we're approaching this, this study of urban crime through a Marxist framework, that assumes this and this and this as outlined by, Smith, Jones, and I hate myself, right? This would be, some people will approach it that way. So you can do it kind of either way. My personal preference is to just generate your own theory off a kind of a framework.
Can you re-explain what you mean by number 5, conceptual theoretical work?
Well, yeah, I can. Okay. So conceptual work, right? Evaluate the data and relate it to your research question, right? So here you would actually generate probably a theory from the data, right? So from the data, you would be right. You would come up with a statement like, and this would be your kind of middle range theoretical explanation, right? Crime may not be as damaging to a community as outsiders think if there are cushioning factors, right? So that's a theoretical statement, right? So this person, whoever it is, did the research on high crime communities and said, they observed residents don't perceive crime as that big of a problem, so it might not be as big of a problem if there are some cushioning factors. Although crime is recognized as common, networks of localized support reduce the potential or at least fear of actual violence. Okay, and then this sentence probably should be off on a bullet point, the last one. So basically that's would be the theory that they're drawing, right? So they're creating a sort of middle ground or middle range theory to explain this particular phenomenon of how people perceive, safety in a high crime kind of area, right? So they're generating a sort of, you can almost say like a hypothesis or a theory out of that data, right? Their own kind of explanation. But yeah, it doesn't look here like it's linked to, some broader theory of crime or something like that, right? They're generating it more or less out of the data. Does that help? Okay. What was I? Just wait till the ambulance passes. Okay, so qualitative research, yeah, often like one of the most common things that you'll see people doing when it comes to qualitative research, like if you read like a dissertation or a book or a paper, you'll often hear people that are doing qualitative work talking about a grounded theory approach. The use of data to develop theories, right? So grounded theory is essentially what I just kind of outlined. So here it says like it might involve an iterative process, going back and forth from data to theory, revising the theory in process. Okay, so grounded theory, right? The idea with grounded theory is that you ground your theory. I know this is going to sound dumb and super self-evident. You ground your theory of a phenomenon in the actual data, right? So rather than generating a theory and then getting data to try and prove it right or wrong, you actually ground your theory in data. And that's what grounded theory is all about, right? So it's often an iterative process, and I should check that I don't have this on the next slide. Okay, I don't. That goes back and forth from data to theory, revising it in the process, right? So usually the way grounded theory is sort of thought of in social research is that you collect data, you come up with your explanation, of that data. And then you go, and so that's your first iteration, right? And then, okay, now I have from this data, I've grounded a theory in this data. Well, what I'm going to do then is I'm going to go back and collect more data. Maybe I did research in one high crime neighborhood, right? And so now I have a theory about, I think, how high crime neighborhoods work. Then I go to another high crime neighborhood and I do more research in that into this new high crime neighborhood, gather a bunch of data, and then I analyze that data and I'm like, okay, I'm going to check my theory, right? So my theory was, X, Y, Z, there might be cushioning factors and people don't, even in high crime neighborhoods, people might not perceive crime as that big of a problem. But in the second community, I find that elderly people in that community find high crime to be very threatening, whereas younger people don't. Because that's now a new phenomenon. So I would rewrite my theoretical statement being like, whatever, the elderly people seem to experience less cushioning factors than young people. Okay, and then you would go and, test, maybe find another high crime neighborhood, do more research and test. Now, if you find new factors that you didn't think of in those first two communities, you would then revise your theory and then go and do more research to double check it. Or if, that third community, everything lines up with the theory you created from those first two communities, then you're like, okay, I think I've explained everything and I can stop, right? And then you can start writing your dissertation or whatever it happens to be. So, and this can go back and forth for a long time, right? Depending on how diligent people are with going through the data, it can be this kind of long iterative process that we kind of work through over time. So yeah, please. Like bit by bit, right? So like think of it like step by step, right? You have your first step and then you build on that, you build on that, you build on it until by the end you have a much larger framework. So each one is an iteration. Good. Yeah, so qualitative research often involves testing theories, right? Or occasionally through theory testing in a conventional sense. So either that iterative process like building and checking, or, you just have you create a theory and then it's less common, just test it against a data set that you come up with. That iterative process is really the most common way, right? That grounded theory process. Even people who don't use the term grounded theory in kind of qualitative research are almost always doing it. Okay. So, couple of concepts here. Definite versus sensitizing concepts in qualitative research. Okay, or definitive, sorry, definitive. Definitive concepts define, so sometimes, in doing qualitative research, you might lay out some concepts that you want to study, and you could do this, in the same way as we just did it with quantitative research, right? Come up with a nominal, if you're wanting to talk about, safety and high crime neighborhoods, right? You can come up with a nominal definition of both of those things, and an operational definition like we did before. Now, the operationalization is going to look very different in qualitative research, right? Because you're not going to be like, I'm going to ask these sorts of questions on a survey, right? Because obviously when you're doing qualitative research, you're not going to be doing that. If you're going to be, your operational definition, you're going to talk about safety and perceptions of safety in high crime neighborhoods, your operational definition will look something more like you're going to interview residents of high crime neighborhoods and ask them about how they perceive them as either safe or unsafe. It looks a little bit different because you're going to be using different methodologies, but it's the same basic process, right? And this might be the easier, like on your major lab, since you've already kind of acquired these skills in that first major lab. On the second major lab, you might, still going to ask you what your concepts are. You might just want to go with, definitive concepts in the way that you've done it, because you've already hopefully gotten good at this. Okay, sensitizing concepts. Again, a little bit more nebulous. Basically, sensitizing concepts provide only a general sense of reference and guidance to the content of the concept, right? So if you're talking about high crime neighborhoods, you wouldn't give like a nominal and a operational definition. You would start with kind of a broad definition of the concept and narrow it down through the research project. So you would start with high crime neighborhoods, you might, really with a sensitizing concept, you might just start with the notion that, the concept is just this hugely broad thing, right? High crime neighborhoods are neighborhoods where, a lot of police reported crime is committed, and safety, almost like you're just starting with nominal definitions. Say perception of safety is how safe people feel, and then you kind of whittle that down, right? You might come up with ways of refining that over the time, right? So, it's a sensitizing concept in the sense that you start with a broad definition and you make it more sensitive to your research project as you move through, right? You will redefine terms as you get a better sense of what's actually going on. And that's basically sensitizing concepts. Okay, does that make sense? So it gets more sensitive to the phenomenon as you go through the research project and you narrow down what you're actually talking about. You're good? Okay. I wasn't sure.
Could you give another example of if you were going to sensitize a concept, what that would look like?
Okay. Yeah, I can try. All right, let's say that you're interested in the concept of power, right? So you're interested in, let's say how people exercise power in the workplace, right? You might start with a kind of general sense of, power is, the ability to influence other people or to control them. As you start doing your work, you realize that actually, what you're seeing in terms of power is more someone's ability to not just make people do things, but make people see a situation the same way they do, right? So you might come up with a more refined definition of power, which is something like, power in the kind of workplace or in these workplace dynamics is the ability to impose your subjectivity on someone else, right? Because that's what you're seeing is people actually, who have power in the workplace are actually able to change people's minds and get them to see, Betty from accounting the same way that they see Betty from accounting, right? Or something like that. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Are we good with this? All right. How are we doing for time? Lots of time left. Okay. Uh, yeah. So, in terms of like the way that we analyze how good, say, qualitative research is, we talk about trustworthiness and authenticity as the key terms, right? So trustworthiness has 4 basic criteria: credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. And authenticity, right, is just the don't worry, I'll go through these. Authenticity is just the degree to which research is transformative and emancipatory for the people studied and society at large, right? So this is a very activist-y kind of way of reading, like how authentic is the research? How much social change does it have the power to create, right? Okay, so let's go through credibility. All right, so credibility. Do the people studied agree with the interpretation of their thoughts and actions offered by the researcher, right? So this is conducted typically through respondent member validation. Okay, I mean we had this discussion. This was where Sandra, my boss, thought actually focus groups can be really good for establishing the credibility of qualitative research, right? So what she said is what she likes to do is when she's like, finished the research study and she's written up her reports, she'll do a focus group of some of the participants, and she'll sort of do a quick presentation of the findings and conclusions to try and establish the credibility of her own research, right? So she'll present what she thinks and then sort of listen to what people have to say. So some of the problems with it, so member validation, right? You sometimes you send the research to people, have them read it, and then they can give you feedback, or focus groups are a really good way to do it. So sometimes the people studied might become defensive and try to censor the research, right? Especially the case if research findings are controversial. People might do all sorts of things to try and, they might phone your boss, they might phone the university, start a campaign against you. Like this has happened to researchers where, people didn't like the products of the research. I mean, for the curious, look up the kind of case of Mark Rigneris at University of Texas at Austin, where this is precisely what happened, right? People tried to censor the research and tried to get him fired. I mean, people studied might not give you genuine feedback on what you produced, or the researcher produced, but may instead try to please the researcher, right? This happens a lot, especially like with ethnographic work and interviews where, you spent time with people, maybe you did a few interviews with people, and they just really want to make you happy, right? Because they like you, they got to like you, and you had a really positive interaction, and they might not tell you what actually they thought of your research, so that, it can be hard to establish credibility there. Sometimes people studied might not have expertise to provide meaningful comments. Sometimes a population, you might have a better insight and you have better vocabulary and concepts to kind of figure out what's going on than the community that you were studying. And so they may not have the expertise to sort of judge what's going on. But credibility, basically, do the people studied agree with your interpretation of their lives, of their phenomena? Okay, so transferability. Can the findings be applied to other contexts or people not studied? This is a hard one with qualitative research, right? Because there's always going to be, I think, limits to how transferable very particular pieces of qualitative work are going to be, right? So, for instance, we had a workshop last year at the CCR where we brought in some of the top prison researchers in the world, right? And we had one guy from Norway. He was a really interesting guy, but he had these rich ethnographic descriptions of life in Norwegian prisons, and I've had a worse time at a Mexican resort than it sounds like people have at Norwegian prisons. And so, it was like, he's like, well, I swear, like Norwegian prisons are amazing. It's like, you go to the steam room, you go to the spa in your Norwegian prison, there's a fence, but it's like this tall. It was crazy. We were all like, what is even happening? What is this? He's showing pictures of it. And I'm like, I think I've stayed in crappier hotel rooms. I'm not even kidding, and paid like a good amount of money for it. But right, okay. So what happens, right? Sometimes it's so particular that things can't be transferred, right? You might be so kind of locked into one perspective that transferability is not possible, and especially intercultural, right? One subculture, might not have you might be able to say general things about subcultures, but it might not holistically transfer to other subcultures or whatever. So typically, right, thick descriptions help determine whether transferability is possible, right? So when people write their accounts, right, these really detailed accounts of, say, what life is like in a Norwegian prison, then you can see, well, would this concept that this person has of like reintegration and rehabilitation make any sense in your context of, say, an American prison, right, where there's drugs and it's a fairly nasty place in general, or Canadian prisons, right? So it has to provide enough information to conduct later comparisons to findings, from other people who might, use the same procedures, and that'll suggest whether a piece of research is transferable. Now, it's not the end of the world, if it's not. But it does, kind of potentially undermine the trustworthiness of the research in general, right? If it can't be applied in any other context because it's so specific. Okay, dependability. This one's a little bit easier to judge. Were proper procedures followed, right? And this is mostly a methodological question, right? Did you do everything right? Did you construct your interviews or conduct your interviews in ways that were conducive, right? We had this debate at the CCR a couple days ago too, because we were listening to a research presentation, which was really good, but one of the things that came up was that they were studying, unhoused populations, and they were giving them basically for a half hour of interview time, a $30 gift card, which some of us felt was coercive, right? Because if you're talking about unhoused populations, you're paying them through 4 times minimum wage to spend a half hour with you. Is that too coercive? Like, could they reasonably say no, right? So dependability, and then would you be getting, proper consent, proper information? Because are they then just trying to tell you things that's going to make you happy because you're giving them a chunk of money that to them might be considerable, right? So a lot of these ethical considerations, like, were proper procedures followed? Did you do things right? Did you make sure that it wasn't coercive? Did you make sure people were comfortable? Did you make sure they knew they could leave and remove their data? Did you write the interview, in such a way as to not create leading questions, right? If you're doing ethnography, right? Did you situate yourself properly so as not to create reactivity if you couldn't, right? Or did you do everything right so that the proper procedures were followed? And can your theoretical inferences be justified, right? And this was the big question that we had about this presentation. They made a bunch of theoretical inferences about unhoused populations, but could we justify that given, how much inducement they were giving to participate in the research? Did that skew maybe the way that people were talking to them? Okay, so auditing, sometimes auditing can be a way that we determine whether something's dependable, whether it followed proper procedures. You'll see this a lot in kind of peer review, right? When someone is writing up for a journal or a book, right, they'll go to peer review. Some other expert in the field will look at this and say, okay, this in their procedure was dependable. It was done properly, so the study is dependable, right? And that's a big way that dependability will be assessed, is in that peer review process. In extreme cases, right? And certainly, again, you can look up Mark Regnerus and see what happened to him. This might involve people actually requesting your data set and then running, say, an analysis of your data set to check that everything was done properly. I've seen this happen probably a half dozen times, where in order to go through publication, a journal actually requested someone's data, right? So it's like, I want to see your interview. use, right? Please provide it. And so, I mean, a lot of big national studies will now post their data online so anyone can look at it. But yeah, I mean, sometimes this can be long-term, it can be expensive. You know, if it gets into this point with publication, you might be looking at 3 to 4 years before an article that you produced gets published. So it can be time-consuming, expensive, and frankly, kind of a pain in the butt. And people really don't like you if you're the reviewer, like reviewer A on the paper that said, oh, we should probably review this person's data. You are, I mean, thankfully it's anonymous, but you're going to be the least popular reviewer A in the universe. But, you know, this happens far too infrequently because I've seen and know of a lot of people who made up data who would have benefited from, yes, people actually do make up data in academic research. I know at least 3 people who've done it. And like indirectly, I don't know them personally, but people have told me that this person made up data and published in very prestigious journals with fake data. And they know because they did the research project with them and they're like, that data's not there. And yet they said nothing. So auditing for dependability would have been good in that case. All right. And confirmability. Oh, the target. Yeah, was the research, you know, when we're talking about confirmability, was the researcher objective and unbiased? It's never possible to be completely unbiased. But, you know, if there's an obvious bias in the research and the researcher, you know, this obviously can be a problem. Did the researcher sway results dramatically, right? And this happens especially when you get into that, you know, sorry, I'm going to flick back into my methodologies here. Which one was it? It was participatory action research. I forgot the term for a sec. Sorry, I'm trying to give you all a seizure. Yeah, participatory action research, right? Sometimes people care so much about an issue that they may actually sway the research by the way they pose the question, sometimes by, you know, especially in qualitative research where you're not expected to do probability sampling, right? By the participants that you select for a particular research study, right? That can all sway the research. And so, right, this again, did the researcher want to come up with certain results? And so they created the conditions in which those results would come out. And this sadly happens much more frequently than you might think, where people want to make an ideological point, right? Because they care so much about an issue that they sway the research projects that they're doing in such a way as it's sort of unavoidable. Okay. Yeah, auditing can be used to examine this, right? Again, like looking at their procedures. And I mean, there's lots of times now, and it's becoming unfortunately much more common that it comes out that people, yeah, did, you know, sway data. It allowed them to get these massive research grants because they came up with such dramatic results. But then, you know, years later, it comes out that the studies weren't done properly. And so, you know, it creates scandal in the academy, and it gives, you know, Ben Shapiro something to talk about on his podcast. Yeah, please.
So is auditing like replicability?
So auditing is actually like, you would ask for someone's data, right? And probably their procedures, right? So like, let's say that they submit a manuscript to a book publisher and you're reading it and you're very clever and you're like, something seems off about this data set, right? Like the conclusions are too perfectly matched to sort of this person's ideological agenda. And you're like, I need to see the data. So you request before publication that they provide you with their interview transcripts. And then you go and you like look through them and you recode them, right? You can imagine how much work this is, right? Not even your data. You listen to all the interviews, you recode them. You're actually like auditing, like someone would audit your taxes, basically. You're auditing the data and how they got it. So you're listening to how they asked the questions, what kind of questions they asked.
A group or a person you go to audit something, like whose job is to audit?
So usually it's reviewers, and usually one of the problems is it's usually voluntary. Occasionally, like, okay, so this this happened to Mark Rigneris, where basically a group of people kicked up a lot of fuss about an article he wrote, and so they requested his data, and they actually got a panel of editors from the journal to go through all the data and basically reanalyze all of it to check his results. So that might happen at the journal level, at the publisher level. In very rare cases, it can happen at the university level. Like if the university feels that someone has conducted something unethically, they can actually audit all of those procedures. And so they would get other professors from different departments to come in and look at the data. And especially now, or people from other universities that don't know that person to come in and look through the data. And in that case, it would be paid. But typically it's done on a voluntary basis, which is why it doesn't happen that often. Yeah, please.
What's the difference between dependability and confirmability? Because I'm assuming if the researcher being, objective and unbiased is part of all the procedures. So is the first kind of like how you structured it, and then the second one's more like, did you mess it up, like on like a personal?
Yeah, did you do it on, like, did you purposely, like, so confirmability is more, did you purposely skew it, right? Like, in one case, it's like, I think a little bit less voluntary to, like, did you follow the proper procedures, or are you just kind of dumb and you don't know how to do research? Does that make sense? Like, or you screwed something up, and this happens, right? People mess something up, they make a mistake. Sometimes they make a mistake with coding and they miscode something. Maybe there was interviewer variance that they didn't account for. So you had 3 interviewers asking the same questions, but in completely different ways. There's all sorts of ways that like a procedure could fall apart, or, you did something, you didn't skew the research on purpose, but you might have done something that was a little bit outside the right window of doing things, right? You paid people too much, and it skewed your research. You didn't do it because you were trying to get to a particular point, which is more kind of the dependability part. You weren't trying to achieve a result, but you ended up achieving it because you didn't do things the right way.
And then dependability is more like kind of like try to skew it.
Right, like typically you have an ideological kind of bent, or this happens sometimes, you've become famous for a particular theory, and it's like you need to then justify that your theory is correct. So you skew the research so that you prove your own theory because you've, built your name and you founded the Jeff Broussard Research Institute for Russian television, and everybody now subscribes to your particular theory. But in order to kind of maintain your position, you have to keep kind of being like, see, I was right. And so you skew the research in such a way as to, in a sense, in that case, secure your position in the academy, right?
Would you use the term auditing if somebody's requesting data sets to seek dependability, or is auditing just for compliance?
So it could be for both, right? You could audit someone's procedures or someone's kind of research for both reasons, right? But basically an audit is just like, if you think there's something wrong with it, you request to audit the data so that you can then see either was there a problem with dependability or confirmability, right? Does that make sense? Okay. See, that clock says 12:14. This one says 12:09. All right. Maybe we should just let you go for today. 10 minutes early. You can use that 10 minutes to get a coffee and then go work on your major lab. I'm sure all of you are done and have no more work to do. It'll be great. You've already submitted. But for that one person who doesn't, why don't you go get a coffee? We'll continue on Tuesday. And I will get on marking your exams at some point this weekend and hopefully get it back to you in relatively short order. All right. See you next week. If you have any questions, I will attempt to get into my email sometime today, and hopefully it works. Currently, I am completely locked out, so if I don't answer, just assume I've failed.